The air in the Beacon Hill conference room was so cold it felt like a tomb, the scent of lemon polish and old paper doing little to warm the sterile silence. My daughter-in-law, Catherine, stood at the head of the impossibly long mahogany table, a portrait of icy composure in her tailored charcoal suit. Without a flicker of emotion, her voice as crisp as the winter air outside, she announced she was dissolving my claim to my husband Arthur's $52 million estate. I felt the world tilt, the blood draining from my face, as the 7 dark-suited lawyers around the table stared pointedly at their notepads. I had held Arthur's hand through every agonizing step of his final illness. Now, I was being erased with a single bloodless sentence. But then my husband's oldest friend and our lifelong attorney, Julian Croft, did something utterly unexpected. He started to laugh. It was a low, quiet chuckle that cut through the sterile silence, like a crack in a frozen lake. It was in that moment, seeing the flash of fury in Catherine's eyes, that I knew my husband had left behind more than just a will. He had left behind a war, and the first move had just been made. I should have seen it coming. The signs had been there, subtle as hairline fractures in a porcelain cup. I stood alone in our garden on Louisburg Square after the funeral, watching the last of the black cars drive away. They left behind half-full cups of tea, perfectly folded napkins, and the funereal scent of lilies, but no one thought to ask if I, the widow, needed a ride home. Catherine had arranged everything, of course. The service was a masterpiece of cold, flawless efficiency, timed to the second. Arthur would have despised it. He used to say funerals should be messy, filled with loud crying, bad jokes, and shared clumsy comfort. This felt rehearsed, a final, polished act in a play where I was merely a silent spectator. When I stepped back inside the quiet brownstone, the house we had shared for 43 years, Catherine was already at the dining table, stacking legal folders with a robotic precision. "We'll be moving ahead with the legal processing next week," she'd said, not looking up. "I've arranged everything with the firm." There was no mention of me, no question about my wishes, no acknowledgement of the 6 months I'd spent sleeping in a hospital chair while she was flying to Zurich for banking conferences. She had handed me a small, velvet-wrapped box. "Arthur asked me to give you this," she'd said, her tone implying it was a final, sentimental afterthought. Inside was not a piece of jewelry or a locket with his picture. It was a single, hand-carved ivory chess piece, a white queen. No note, no letter. Arthur, a man who filled journals with his thoughts and left me notes on my pillow, had left me a chess piece. It wasn't even from our set. I'd never seen it before. Catherine had offered a thin, polite smile and walked away, as if she had just closed the book on our shared history. That night, sitting in the vast, silent kitchen, I felt like a ghost in my own home. The walls still held the faint scent of Arthur's pipe tobacco. His well-worn copy of Marcus Aurelius was still on the nightstand, but it was as if my name had been quietly sanded off every surface. It was more than grief. It was a creeping, chilling sense of erasure. Now, in this frigid conference room, the feeling was no longer a creeping suspicion. It was a declared fact. Catherine cleared her throat, her eyes sweeping over the room, deliberately skipping over me. "As executor of the estate and primary trustee," she began, her voice resonating with a power she had clearly been practicing, "I'll be walking us through the distribution of assets as laid out in the finalized will signed by my father-in-law 6 months prior to his passing." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. I was the only person at the table without a leather-bound portfolio, the only one not holding a pen. She went through the assets like an auctioneer: stocks, trust accounts, 2 commercial properties in Salem, a partial ownership of a Napa winery. Then she dropped the bomb. "Arthur transferred primary control of the Vance Family Trust to me 6 months ago to streamline its management moving forward." I blinked. It wasn't possible. Arthur and I had been co-trustees for 20 years. He would never make a change like that without 100 conversations, a dozen late-night debates over glasses of scotch. He would never have done it without me. Catherine continued without a pause, reading off allocations to various charities and a distant cousin, her voice a relentless, emotionless drone. My name never came up. At the end, one of the junior associates, a young man who couldn't hide his discomfort, finally asked, "And Mrs. Vance's share?" Catherine looked up, her gaze as cold and clear as glass. "There are no remaining distributions assigned to Eleanora Vance under the current filing." Just like that, no apology, no explanation, the legal version of being unpersoned. I felt a strange, white-hot heat rise up my spine, but my hands remained perfectly still in my lap. And that was when Julian Croft, who had been silent until now, began to laugh. The room froze. All eyes turned to him. He wasn't mocking or hysterical. It was a dry, knowing chuckle. He leaned back in his leather chair, a small, genuine smile playing on his lips. "My apologies," he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "I was just recalling a conversation I had with Arthur a few months ago. He had a unique appreciation for strategic games." Catherine's eyes narrowed into slits. "I'm not sure I see the relevance, Julian." "Oh, I think you will," he said, his smile never wavering. He then turned his gaze to me, the first person to truly look at me all morning. It was a look of shared history, of profound, unspoken understanding. When the meeting was over, a tense, awkward affair that ended abruptly, I waited for everyone else to file out. Catherine packed her briefcase with slow, deliberate movements, clearly expecting a confrontation, a scene. I gave her none. I simply stood, adjusted the silk scarf at my neck, and walked out without a word, feeling Julian's steady gaze on my back. Downstairs, the biting Boston wind slapped my cheeks, but I didn't cry. The hollowness I had felt was replaced by a single burning question. Why had Julian laughed? And what game had my husband set in motion before he died? That afternoon, I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the dark of Arthur's study, the silence of the house a living entity around me. His cane still rested by the door, his scent still lingered on the worn leather of his armchair. My hands acted before my mind caught up, pulling open the squeaky top drawer of his desk. He always meant to oil it. I always said I liked the sound. It meant he was home. Beneath a clutter of old receipts and fountain pens, I found a small, unlabeled manila folder. I'd never seen it before. Inside were 3 sheets of paper. The first was a handwritten note from Arthur, his script a bit shaky from his illness. "Catherine wants me to update the will. Says it's for clarity. I think she's being careful, too careful. She's started drawing up papers on my behalf. I haven't signed anything yet. Haven't told Eleanora. I know she'd ask the questions I'm too tired to face." He had known. He had sensed her maneuvering, but in his weakened state, he had retreated into silence rather than face a confrontation. The second page was a photocopy of a draft will, different from the one Catherine had presented. It was covered in annotations. My name was there, in a sentence that had been brutally crossed out. "I leave my personal assets, including home shares and designated accounts, to my beloved wife, Eleanora Vance." In the margin, in what looked like Catherine's neat, sharp script, was a note, "Revised to reflect trustee authority." The third page was a typed schedule of legal consultations. The dates corresponded with the times I had been at the hospital, and Catherine had come to sit with him so I could rest. She hadn't been sitting with him. She had been working. The folder was thin, but it felt as heavy as a tombstone. This wasn't a mistake. This was a coup, orchestrated during the most vulnerable moments of our lives. I placed the papers back in the folder and hid it beneath a stack of old National Geographic magazines in the hall closet, a place so mundane no one would ever look. I didn't have a plan, but I had a starting point, and I knew who to call. Julian Croft met me at a quiet corner cafe on Charles Street, a place of dark wood and the comforting scent of old books. He slid into the booth across from me, his expression grim but resolute. I passed him the folder without a word. He read in silence, his brow tightening when he reached Arthur's shaky handwriting. "It's worse than I thought," he said, his voice low, but not unexpected. "Arthur called me about 8 months ago. He was worried. He said Catherine was becoming efficient. That was his word for it. He told me he was putting a contingency plan in place, something for you in case his own strength failed him. He called it his Queen's Gambit." Julian looked at me. He never told me the details. "He just said you would know what to do when the time came. The chess piece, Eleonora. What did you do with it?" I had placed it on my dresser, a beautiful but painful reminder. That night I examined it under a bright lamp. It was old, the ivory yellowed with age, and heavier than it looked. On a hunch, I twisted the base. With a soft click, it unscrewed. Tucked inside the hollowed-out bottom was a tiny, tightly rolled piece of paper. On it, in Arthur's minuscule script, were 2 words, Hal Givens. I recognized the name. A discreet tax consultant Arthur had used for a non-profit venture years ago. The next day, Julian made a quiet inquiry. Hal Givens remembered the meeting with Arthur vividly. Arthur had come in looking exhausted but resolute. He hadn't wanted to discuss his will. He wanted to set up a completely separate blind trust. An anonymous entity funded through a series of complex offshore transfers. Hal had helped set up the initial framework, but Arthur had finalized it with a different, unknown firm. The trust's name was the Eleonora Safeguard. Its total value was unknown to Hal, but he knew the initial seed money was substantial, and its trigger for activation, the moment Catherine made a move to formally disinherit me. The will reading had been the tripwire. Julian's laugh in the conference room hadn't been one of amusement. It had been one of activation. The game had begun. The next few days were a quiet storm of activity. Julian introduced me to a probate litigation specialist he trusted, a sharp, unflappable woman named Anya Sharma. While Anya began drafting the legal challenges, Julian and I followed the breadcrumbs Arthur had left. The name of the law firm Hal Givens had mentioned was a dead end. It had been a shell corporation that dissolved after a single transaction. But Arthur's calendar, which Catherine had overlooked in her sweep of his belongings, held another clue. A penciled-in name on a Tuesday morning circled twice, Grace Miller. Julian recognized the name immediately. Grace Miller was a junior legal assistant at Catherine's own firm. It was a huge risk for her to speak to us, but Julian reached out through a trusted back channel. 2 days later, a plain envelope arrived at my door. Inside was a flash drive. It contained scans of email exchanges between Catherine and her legal team. They were cold, calculating, and utterly damning. They detailed her strategy to have Arthur declared mentally incompetent if he resisted signing the new will, to isolate him from old friends, and to use his declining health as the perfect cover. The most chilling email, sent just a week before his death, instructed her team to liquidate silently any assets jointly held with me, moving them into accounts she alone controlled. We had her. But Anya warned that Catherine would not go down without a fight. She would use her immense resources to bury us in motions and delays. We needed more than just evidence of her intent. We needed proof of outright fraud. That proof, Julian suspected, was tied to the witness signatures on the will. Anya's investigators discovered that the 2 witnesses were notaries for hire with a history of signing documents without being present, for a price. The final piece of the puzzle was in a place Catherine would never have thought to look: Arthur's collection of first edition poetry. Tucked inside a worn volume of Yeats, I found a receipt from a private document storage facility and a small key. The next day, Julian and I went to the facility. In a climate-controlled room, we opened a small metal box. Inside was Arthur's original, signed and notarized will from a year prior, leaving the bulk of his estate and control of the trust to me. Alongside it was a sworn affidavit from his personal physician, dated from the same week Catherine's new will was signed, stating that due to his medication, Arthur was not of sound mind to make complex legal decisions during that period. He had documented his own incapacitation. He had built his own fortress, brick by painstaking brick. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. I spent hours in Anya's office reviewing timelines, budgets, and correspondence. The more I delved into the records, the more I understood the depth of my husband's foresight. He had constructed this defense to be both possible and irrefutable, but its success depended entirely on my willingness to see it through. He hadn't left me a victory, he had left me a fight I was capable of winning. We decided against a direct public confrontation. Instead, Anya filed a quiet, devastatingly precise motion to contest the will, submitting every piece of evidence at once: the emails, the original will, the doctor's affidavit, and a deposition from Grace Miller, who had agreed to testify about the pressure she'd witnessed. The filing was sealed, but a copy was delivered directly to Catherine and every member of the Foundation's board. We didn't give her time to spin a narrative or discredit us. We simply presented the truth. 2 days later, the invitation arrived. A cream-colored envelope slipped through my front door. The estate board was holding an emergency session to finalize the transfer of executive authority. It was a power play, a final performance where Catherine intended to solidify her control before the lawsuit could become public knowledge. "I'm going," I told Julian. He hesitated, but I insisted. "I won't make a scene. I just need to be there." I need to be in the room. That Thursday, I arrived at the Foundation's downtown office 5 minutes early. The conference room was the same as before, a glass box filled with powerful men in quiet suits. At the head of the table sat Catherine. When she saw me, her mask of composure flickered for a fraction of a second. I nodded politely and took the empty seat at the far end of the table, the one they always left for observers. The meeting began. When they reached the item marked Transition of Executive Oversight, Rebecca cleared her throat and began a well-rehearsed speech about continuity and responsibility. Then she made her fatal mistake. She thanked me. She said I had stood by Arthur, helped lay the foundation, and now, with your grace, I carry it forward. Your grace, as if I had willingly handed her the crown. I sat still, letting the silence hang in the air after her words. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a single, slim folder. I didn't pass it down the table, I simply placed it in front of me. Inside, clearly visible, was the title page of Anya's legal filing. Eleonora Vance Fee. Catherine Vance, re-estate of Arthur Vance. Allegations of fraud and undue influence. I didn't need to say a word. The board members closest to me read the title. A ripple of silent, shocked communication moved down the table. Catherine's face went white. Her perfectly constructed world was collapsing in on her, not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of a single piece of paper. I stood up. "Thank you for the invitation," I said, my voice even and clear. "My attorney will be in touch, should anyone here require clarification." And I walked out. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I just walked, my footsteps echoing on the marble floor. It was over. The next day, Catherine officially withdrew from her position as executor and trustee, citing personal reasons. The board launched an internal investigation. The will she had filed was invalidated, and Arthur's original will was instated as his final testament. The war was won. A month later, after the dust had settled, I sat in Arthur's study. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not one of absence, but of peace. Julian had stopped by to drop off the last of the legal papers. He also brought a small, sealed box. Arthur left this with me, he said. He told me to give it to you only after the game was over. Inside was not a document, but a leather-bound journal. It was filled with his handwriting from his final year. He wrote of his love for me, his fears, his admiration for Catherine's brilliance, and his growing terror at her lack of a moral compass. The final entry, written just 3 days before he died, was addressed to me. "My dearest Eleonora," it read, "I am sorry for the battle I am leaving you." I could have confronted her, but I feared the ugliness of that fight would be the last memory you had of my life. Instead, I chose to leave you a puzzle, a game worthy of my queen. I could not be your shield, so I chose to leave you a sword. I have never doubted for a moment that you would know how to wield it. Your victory is my final legacy. Your strength is my final peace. Tears streamed down my face as I read the words, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, aching love. He hadn't abandoned me. He hadn't failed to protect me. He had trusted me. He had trusted in the strength he had always seen in me, the strength I had forgotten I possessed. The greatest act of love, I realized, isn't to shelter someone from the storm. It's to build them a boat and trust they have the courage to sail it. I was not a woman erased. I was not a victim of betrayal. I was the keeper of a legacy I had earned, the victor in a game played for the highest stakes of all, truth, honor, and a love that even death could not conquer.